Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about something called the Bonshoff Power Index. And this sounds really weird, but it was named after a guy called John Bonshoff in 1965. It was originally created by Lionel Penrose. But it's a power index that actually gives you a numerical measure of how much power you have in a weighted voting system. And you might be thinking, well, I thought we could tell that already at the beginning of these weighted voting systems because we could see how many votes each player had. Well, the number of votes that you have doesn't actually determine how much power you have. The amount of power that you have in a weighted voting system comes in how critical you are or how necessary you are in all of the winning coalitions that exist. And that's a weird thought, but we're going to run through an example so you can see how power in a weighted voting system is actually calculated. Okay, so if we're looking here, there is a step-by-step for what I'm about to show you. You guys are more than welcome to read that, and if you get stuck, you can always reference the notes and make sure that you've gone through these steps in order. Okay, so let's look at our example here. So we're going to find the Bonshoff Power Index, which is really just a fancy way of saying we want to know how much power each player has in this voting system right here. All right, so we have a voting system where the quota is 8. We have 3 players with weights of 6, 3, and 2. All right. So the first thing we got to do is we got to start by listing all of the winning coalitions. And a quick note on this, this can actually be the most difficult part of the problem is just getting a list of all the winning coalitions. Here in the example, I've created the list for you, but you might run into a situation where you have to create that list yourself. So make sure that you are systematic with it. Make sure you get all of them. All right. There's really no guaranteed systematic way to do it, but you might start with finding all of the coalitions that have 3 players, then find all the coalitions that have 2 players, and then find all of your single player coalitions and go in order systematically like that. And once you have all the coalitions listed, you can cross out the ones that are not winning coalitions. All right. So that's my advice there. And there's going to be a problem in MyOpenMath today that's going to ask you to practice listing those coalitions. All right. So here we go. I've got all my coalitions listed. This is every possible coalition that can come out of this voting system. So I'm just going to tally up the total weight for each of these coalitions. So player 1 and player 2. So player 1 has 6 votes. Player 2 has 3 votes. So this coalition has a total weight of 9. All right. Player 1 and player 3 would add up to 8, right? Because they have 6 and 2. And then player 2 and player 3 would be the 3 and the 2, and that would give you a total weight of 5. And those are all of my 2-person coalitions. And then I go to my 3-person coalitions, and my 3-person coalition is all 3 of these, which has a total of 11. Okay. We don't really need to do the single person coalitions here, so like just player 1 all by themselves, because there's no dictator, so we don't have to worry about any of the single player coalitions being a winning coalition. All right, so we're going to go here and we're going to determine which ones are winning coalitions and which ones are losing coalitions. So if we look at this, 9, 8, and 11, so these 3 coalitions are winning coalitions because the quota is 8. But the coalition with player 2 and player 3 is a losing coalition because they only have a total weight of 5. So I'm going to cross them off my list. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out who is critical in each of these coalitions. So remember, to be critical in a coalition, you have to affect the outcome of whether or not they can pass a measure should you leave. All right. So for instance, let's say player 2 gets upset and leaves the coalition here. And remember, their total weight was 9. Okay, so if player 2 leaves and takes their 3 votes with them, they would go from 9 votes down to 6 votes. And that's no longer enough to pass quota. So player 2 is critical. So I'm going to circle player 2 because player 2 in this coalition is critical. And if player 2 is critical, then player 1 must also be critical because player 1 has even more votes than player 2. So I'm circling them both to indicate that they are critical. And then I'm going to go and analyze my next coalition, player 3 and player 1. So remember, they had a total weight of 8. All right, so let's say player 3 gets upset. All right, player 3 had 2 votes. So we would go from 8 votes down to 6, which is not enough to reach quota. So player 3 is critical. You need player 3 in that coalition for it to be successful. And if player 3 is needed, then so is player 1, because player 1 had more votes. So I'm going to circle both of them. So they were both critical. This was not a winning coalition, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then I'm going to go to my 3-person coalition, and let's pretend that player 3 gets upset and decides to leave. So now it's just player 1 and player 2, which gives them 9 votes. So that's enough, right? Player 3 is not really critical. We don't really need player 3 in this coalition to be successful. Let's say player 2 got upset and left. That would leave player 1 and player 3, and that gives you a total of 8 votes, right? 6 plus 2 is 8. So player 2 is not critical either. Player 2 could get upset and go, and player 1 and player 3 would be okay. They would still be able to pass their measure. All right. Now, let's say player 1 got upset and left. Well, if player 1 leaves, it leaves only player 2 and player 3, which only give you 5 votes, and that's not enough for quota. So player 1 is critical in this coalition. All right. So the next step here is just to count up how many times each player is critical. Okay. So player 1 was critical 1, 2, 3 times. Player 2 is critical only once. And player 3 was critical only once. All right. And we're going to convert these to percentages by taking the total number of times each player was critical divided by the number of times any player was critical. So for instance, player 1 was critical 3 times out of a total of 5. There were 5 times that any player was critical, and player 1 was critical for 3 of them. So we would say 3 out of 5. Right? And 3 divided by 5, if you do this in your calculator, is 0.6, which converts to 60%. Right? And that is what that means. Player 1 has 60% of the power in this weighted voting system. Now we would do the same thing for player 2, but player 2 is only critical 1 out of the 5 times. So I'm going to say 1 divided by 5, which, again, if you go to your calculator and do 1 divided by 5, you'll get a 0.2, and then converting that to a percentage gives you 20%. So player 2 had 20% of the power. All right, then we do the same thing for player 3. So we got 1 divided by 5 again, and we already know that that's going to be 0.2 and 20% of the power. Okay. So let's take a look at this. Just a couple of notes. Some things that I want to make sure that you notice here is that the percentages at the end, right, have to add up to 100%, right? So it should add to 100%. If they don't, you probably made a mistake somewhere. All right, so you got to go back and check your work. Maybe you missed a coalition, maybe you miscalculated a percentage, or maybe you miscounted how many times they were critical, but this should always add up to 100%. Okay. The other thing to notice, player 2 and player 3 both had the same amount of power. They both had 20% of the power in this weighted voting system, despite the fact that player 2 had more votes. So remember, I said this at the beginning, the number of votes doesn't necessarily determine how much power you have. Okay? Player 2 has 3 votes, player 3 has 2 votes, yet they both had the same amount of power in the Bonds-Hoff Power Index. Okay? So it's not always about the sheer number of votes, it's about how many of these alliances you are needed for. That's what determines power in a weighted voting system. All right, guys, that's it for today. Make sure you give the practice problems a try. If you have questions, please let me know in the Zoom chat. Have a great day.